We are live.
Good evening to all our listening and viewing audience. Welcome to another edition of Socialist Action Webcasts. So to our audience, do not forget to put your questions to our panelists in the chat column so we will have them during the Q&A. My name is Elizabeth Bice, and I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, a past Secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in the place called Toronto. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is heat. BC is on fire. With leading SA member Flo Schade on Wetsu'wet'en territory, Jean McGuckin of Eco-socialists of Vancouver, and Gary Porter, Socialist Action British Columbia organizer. Flo, Gary, and Jean will each speak up to 15 minutes. After that, we will take questions written into the chat column from the online audience. So, let's begin. I am pleased to welcome Flo Schade, who is a first-generation Canadian of mixed South American, Indigenous, and European heritage, currently residing in northern BC with her Wetsu'wet'en family. Earlier, she worked, studied, and traveled around the world, always with a commitment to critical analysis and social justice. She has a master's degree in religion and science from the University of Edinburgh and a passion for internationalism, anti-imperialism, and struggles for national liberation. She's a recently radicalized libertarian communist and a leading member of Socialist Action. So, welcome, Flo.
Hello and greetings, comrades. I'm speaking to you from northern BC. Here on the shores of Unsha Lake, we reside on traditional Wet'suwet'en Gilsayu Frog Clan territory within the Wet'suwet'en or Thin House. Like many others in the world, those of us in remote parts of northern BC also felt the effects of the heat wave in June. While we were relatively lucky this year that it didn't get too unbearably hot and it at least cooled down overnight, we are no strangers to destructive effects of climate change. My family lived through the 2008 fires that destroyed vast parts of the territory and nearly took out our local general store and gas station. That experience sticks fresh in the mind of many, as it caused massive upheaval for everyone in the area as we scrambled to get out and protect our homes. And now, of course, we have all just witnessed the tragic burning up of the entire town of Lytton, a brutal reminder that things are not getting better. Every summer, it seems my childlike excitement for the season becomes more and more replaced with an ominous feeling about what the summer will burn next. This brings me to the first topic, wildfires. Wildfires are, so far, the most clear manifestation of climate breakdown that we experience in BC, and not surprisingly, the recent heat wave resulted in the outbreak of quite a few. Wildfires perhaps best exemplify the scary exponential nature of climate degradation, as not only are they a symptom of global warming, human activity, and increased extreme weather events, their prevalence also adds staggeringly to the problem of carbon emissions and a warming atmosphere. While forests, particularly old growths, have traditionally been carbon sinks, whose rich subterranean networks trap carbon in the soil, increasing emissions from logging, burning, growth minus decay, and most notably wildfires has actually caused BC forests to become net emitters of carbon since 2002. Now for some statistics. From the excellent article entitled The Climate Disaster Hidden in BC's Forests by Michelle Gamage. By BC's own reporting, forests are the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the province, 23% larger than the total emissions from the energy sector. In the 1990s, wildfires spat out a couple of hundred to a couple thousand annual kilotons of emissions. By 2018, that had jumped to around 200 megatons. For context, the total reported emissions from the oil and gas industry in Canada was 191 megatons in 2019. Astonishingly, the The province, an NDP government, doesn't count these emissions in official carbon reporting, allowing BC to keep up the narrative that logging is climate friendly and that nothing is going fundamentally wrong in our forests. It's simply not the case. Clear-cutting, monoculture, and slash-burning activities degrade the capacity of a thriving forest to act as a carbon sink, as well as leave it more susceptible to wildfire. Gamage continues. In BC, if BC included emissions counted under forest management in its official inventory total, the province's annual CO2 emissions would jump to 305.3 megatons in 2018 instead of 67.9 megatons. So it strikes me as incumbent upon us folks residing in this place we call British Columbia to demand that at the very least, the government begin taking into account carbon emissions from forests when calculating emission totals. It's impossible to make informed decisions without all the information. This is just another example of the bourgeois government twisting data gathering and statistics techniques to suit status quo interests, a big problem as well in economic statistics. In the age of big data, we've realized the significance of data collection for decision-making and communication strategy. It's incumbent upon us also to see through the propaganda and ensure that the data gathered by government statistics, so often used to justify certain bureaucratic actions, is also sufficient in content and method to inform the public accurately and allow for meaningful discussion and not just to lend cover for private industry. Getting back to forests. The province likes to hide behind claims that because forest emissions data is mixed up with factors like the pine beetle and lightning strikes and not direct human activity, that it doesn't count. But it's absurd to conclude that human society is not ultimately responsible for the sorry state that BC forests are in, be it pine beetles, wildfire, floods, lightning storms, or some other natural consequence of the human-driven climate crisis. The truth is we are inundated with and completely steeped in different ways that society is organized to contribute to climate breakdown. There's not one aspect of our lives that wasteful, greedy consumer capitalism has not touched and tried to shape for its own interest. This is where the next part of my thinking on this issue comes in, as it concerns the ability of everyday people, even those immediately affected by climate breakdown, to actually escape the dangerous systems that perpetuate it. As Marxists, we understand that people are driven primarily by their material interests, and as such, it wouldn't make much sense to advance demands and proposals which do not safeguard workers' material interests, but in fact ask them to sacrifice it. This has generally been, in my estimation, the approach of the bourgeois environmentalist movements to create a culture war framed around moral values of caring for the earth versus reckless, selfish greed. It makes the problem into an individualistic one, where all the onus is on the person to overcome whatever systemic barriers exist and do whatever it takes to join the anti-fossil fuel movement. When in reality, on the ground, in resource-rich areas like this, I find it comes down to less of a values problem and much more of a social organization and capital reproduction problem. People are, in general, just acting as they always have, which is focused on their most immediate material reality. The onus is on the movement makers to reduce as much as possible the systemic barriers to joining the movement, which is to say first and foremost that it must safeguard the material interests of workers who might otherwise be negatively affected by a sudden termination of industry. People have historically gotten this backwards, in my opinion. They think they can guilt or scare folks into doing the right thing, when really what we need to do is create the conditions wherein doing the right thing and say quitting your pipeline job or turning away multi-million-dollar investments in your community is not potentially ruinous in the immediate term, but is actually shown to serve the material interests of the community members. The only way we're going to do that is with a massive public investment to revolutionize and replace current systems, such as the Green New Deal. Marxists thus have an important and highly underrated role to play in calling for a kind of political economy which would support such a just transition by putting workers' needs at the heart of the planning. Worker incomes are not dispensable. If the movement cares about social buy-in of the masses rather than simply pandering to elites, this message must come through. We have to recognize the fact that a lot of people, particularly in rural areas, support their families with resource extraction incomes. When they look up to see what else is available to them, it's nothing but the abyss. This is score one for the fossil fuel sector, but it need not remain their score because incomes and stable material conditions are not the sole purview of capitalist corporations. Socialists can and should claim these too. How? I would argue that the primary policy prescription for this issue would be a robust jobs guarantee program focused on revolutionizing the energy and resource sectors. The North has traditionally had a very close relationship with the big resource extraction industries: energy, forestry, mining, fisheries, etc. For a long time, sawmills buttressed towns and livelihoods, and when they went under a couple decades ago, many towns and villages were abandoned and development stopped, while social and infrastructural problems increasingly crept in. Resource workers often end up developing a sort of loyalty or fealty to the companies that ostensibly bring economic opportunity when others want to shut it down, particularly while it's appeared that those with other opportunities are happy enough to forget about their needs entirely. This framing leaves an opening for a culture war about different kinds of people with different kinds of values to be exploited. The city slicker versus the country bumpkin. All the while, the fundamental structures of society which generate these dependence differentials go unchanged. In reality, the overwhelming majority of people are not loyal to a certain kind of fuel source, but to their income source. They are loyal ultimately not to a corporation, but to their families, whose immediate well-being they feel they cannot jeopardize by rejecting industry investment. The solution to this in some ways is so obvious then. Propose government investment in green jobs and technologies where industry lacks the profit motive to do so. A centrally planned workers' government would have, I think, mitigated the climate crisis long ago, because industry would not have the lead on creating economic dependence on itself as it does through free market ideology. If we take the legs out from under the jobs argument for supporting the fossil fuel sector, well, there's really not much left there at all. A jobs guarantee would do exactly that. Guarantee a job. It would be a public sector program guaranteeing equal or better income than being offered by the private sector, forcing what becomes left of the private energy sectors to compete. It would allow workers the opportunity to make a free choice between who and what they want to support with their time, instead of this Sophie's choice where we just expect people to act against their own interests in the short term. Obviously, a program like this wouldn't come cheap, which is why I advocate for a federal jobs guarantee, which would be funded by the currency issuing federal government. Such investments into the economy would also not pose as serious an inflation risk as current helicopter money to Wall Street programs such as quantitative easing, because it would actually go towards a productive worker economy and not the asset price inflating speculative one. An important policy coupling to this program would be universal basic services to meet the needs of those not able or willing to work, while public option services such as universal childcare, healthcare, transportation, food programs, and skills training and relocation programs would help keep costs of living down. Of course, private industry lobbyists and insiders will always attempt to advance their own interests to the detriment of the world. But this is ultimately a class issue between proletariat and capitalist. It doesn't need to be a moralized culture issue between workers, because it ultimately rests on the shared foundations of economic material concern, which is actually fertile ground for a Marxist to spread ideas. Framing environmentalism as primarily a values or lifestyle issue allows political factions to exploit differences between working class folks who really all want the same thing: to live a comfortable life. Workers need assurances, and radical socialists are exactly the right people to assure them. It is reasonable for workers of any sector to be wary of government and industry promises within this bourgeois capitalist state. In this system, they would be thrown under the bus. They would be left to twist in the wind. If there is no longer a profit motive, then that's the end of their livelihood. You're on your own. This kind of zero-sum environment leads people to more desperately cling on to what they know, because their future is not guaranteed. We have the opportunity to guarantee a comfortable future even for fossil fuel workers and their families through policy provisions like a jobs guarantee. The scale of the climate crisis is immense. It's not a question of if or even when, but just how and how quickly we can tackle it, and whether our efforts will be enough. If we require all hands on deck to address the scale of the crisis, then we need to move forward in a way that brings people on board along with us. And it happens that socialism could provide the perfect vehicle for that project. Thank you.
Thank you, Flo. Okay, our next speaker is Gary Porter. Gary is a leading member of Socialist Action. He was chair of the Investment Committee and a member of the board of the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund. Gary was first vice chair of the Certified General Accountants in Canada. He is currently a fellow of the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada and a life member. Welcome, Gary. You're muted.
Thank you. With an introduction like that, I almost feel disqualified from talking in a socialist meeting. But okay, so I intend to spend some time trying to portray the heat event that occurred at the end of June in BC, because I don't think very many people get it, not even in BC. The temperature has been rather nice summer temperature since, and most people, the heat event is slipping into their memories. But this was something new and a harbinger of a deadly future that is headed our way. It is not a hype or exaggeration to call it the most extreme heat event in world weather records. I am not alone in saying that. There was an article by Bob Henson, who is a meteorologist and journalist based in Boulder, Colorado, and Jeff Masters, a PhD who has worked as a hurricane scientist with the NOAA hurricane hunters. And their story appeared first in the Yale Climate Connections journal. Hundreds of North Americans, and perhaps many more yet to be tallied, have died owing to heat-related illness and mind-boggling heat waves that struck the U.S. Pacific Northwest and the Canadian and the far southwestern part of Canada. Unbelievably, in June, not even in July, August, which are the hottest months. It's virtually certain to be the deadliest weather event on record in the region. The unprecedented death toll is the result of a heat onslaught more intense by some measures than anything in global records, yet very much in line with the expected impacts of human-oriented climate disruption. The poster community of this horrific episode has to be Lytton, British Columbia. The town broke Canada's long-standing, all-time annual high temperature record of 45 degrees Celsius, with a high of 46.6 on June 27th. The next day brought 47.9, and Tuesday brought 49.6 degrees Celsius, just short of 50 degrees Celsius. The intense heat flash dried the rugged forested landscape around the town. Wildfires mushroomed across the area, and on June 30th, and by evening, the entire town of Lytton was under mandatory evacuation orders. The mayor, Eden Polderman, told CB News that the whole town is on fire. Most homes in Lytton have been destroyed, according to provincial authorities. Lightning from dry thunderstorms had developed, and they were so intense that over 700,000 intra-cloud and cloud-to-ground lightning flashes were recorded in 15 hours, including more than 100,000 cloud-to-ground strikes during that same period. That's about 5% of the total number of lightning flashes Canada normally sees in an entire year. The fires have generated huge clouds of choking smoke that put air quality into the red unhealthy region in Kamloops, according to provincial authorities. The heat disaster's tragic nature is evident in the initial data from BC. BC reported 719 sudden and unexpected deaths, which is 3 times more than usual for this time of year over that period. At least 16 people died in heat-related causes in Seattle, and in Oregon, which includes the county which includes Portland, there were 45 residents who died as a result of excessive heat. The preliminary cause of death is hypothermia. Hyperthermia. The county said the people who died ranged in age from 44 to 97, and 17 women and 27 men. Many had underlying health conditions, it's true. Many of them who died were found alone, without air conditioning or even a fan. Similarly, those who died in BC were found alone in unventilated homes, according to Chief Coroner Lisa Lapointe, as she stated on BBC. The eventual death toll from these heat wave is likely to be much higher than the current estimates. According to Christy Eby, a professor of global health at the University of Washington, death certificates had to be gathered and analyzed from multiple areas. And many deaths have been attributed simply to um, heart conditions, lung conditions, and so on, will also, when analyzed, turn out to have been triggered by the heat. Those numbers are only going to go up, Eby said. Focusing only on factors such as heat stroke gives you a massive underestimate of the overall death toll. Many heat wave deaths are triggered by respiratory and cardiovascular failures, often under-recognized as being related to the torrid, often polluted air of a heat wave. If there's one thing Eby wants to avoid, it's thinking of the catastrophic heat wave as a new normal, which she calls seriously misleading. It actually underestimates the problem. She says that we're going from one state to another state. We're in a period where it's not the heat records that are the problem, it's the change and the rapidity of the change. We're going nowhere but up. The new normal is not the current temperature. The new normal is the change. Otherworldly. So never in this century plus history of world weather observation and record keeping have so many all-time heat records fallen by such a large margin as in the last week of June. The only heat wave that compares to this is the Dust Bowl in July 1936, in the U.S. Midwest and South Central Canada. But even those cannot compare to what happened in northwestern U.S. and Western Canada over that week. There's almost this is the most anomalous regional extreme heat event to occur anywhere on Earth since temperature records began. Nothing can compare, said weather historian Christopher Burt, author of the book Extreme Weather. Pointing to Lytton, he said, there's never been a national heat record in a country with an extensive period of record and multitude of observation sites that was beaten so often, like over 4 days, it kept successively being beaten, and by large amounts. International weather records researcher Maximiliano Herrera agrees. What we're seeing now is a totally unprecedented worldwide event. In an endless waterfall of records being smashed. Some examples of the extreme event. Portland, Oregon had a long-standing record from 1965 to 91. It was 41.1 Celsius, and it went up to 44.6, 46, and 46.6 on Monday. So it was higher than Death Valley. A lot of these temperatures were higher than Death Valley. I'm just going to skip a few of these. So during that period, of course, another feature was that there was no breeze. Night temperatures would be as high as 28 degrees in a lot of places. Laying awake in hot rooms, in sweat, people became exhausted. The heart beats faster. At 35 degrees or thereabouts, there is no cooling effect from sweat because it does not evaporate. If you do not drink enough cool water and cool off with showers or wet towels, your body temperature can begin to rise, and then you will die very quickly. In 2001, only 10% of BC homes had air conditioners. They were simply not necessary. Now 34% have air conditioners, because over the past 20 years, we've seen a continuous climbing of the heat records in the summer. In the week after the heat event, there were no air conditioners available for sale in BC, not even fans. In addition to the stunning number of human deaths, many dogs, cats, and even horses were found to be part of the toll. And we have no way of estimating the impact on the still very plentiful wildlife in BC forests. Oceanographers estimated 1 billion shellfish were washed up on BC shores, dead from the heat. The smell of decomposition overpowering. Fruit crops in some areas were ruined, giving us a preview of the hunger and starvation ahead of us. I personally have ordered a heat pump installed in my home to fight the heat, but the backlog means that it will be late fall or spring even before I have it installed. Oh well, at least I'll have it for next year. The Weather Network had predicted that the summer for BC would be hotter than normal, and now they tell us that the monstrous heat could happen again this year. But it gets worse. We're in a drought. This is day 38 with no rain on South Vancouver Island. And there's no rain predicted until right at the end of the current 14-day prediction period. And then only 1 millimeter on 2 successive days. So only 1/3 of the normal amount of rain has fallen so far this year. There's already over 320 wildfires. In fact, Lytton, the village that set the record heat, was, as I said, was completely destroyed by fire on July the 2nd. That fire burned very intensely because everything was as dry as tinder. People ran for their lives, leaving everything behind, and even so, 2 people were found dead later. More all-time records have been broken by at least 5 degrees Celsius in this past week's heat wave than in the previous 84 years of world weather record keeping, going back to 1936, the year of the Dust Bowl. It's worth noting that the North American heat of the 1930s, including 1936, was largely connected to the Dust Bowl, which reflects with the effects of multi-year drought amplified by overplowing and lack of proper agricultural techniques, which denuded soil and on the Great Plains. This is another example, by the way, an early example of human-induced climate change, albeit it was temporary. Preliminary data from NOAA US Records website show that 55 US stations had the highest temperature in their history in the week ending on June 28th. More than 400 daily record highs were set. Over the past year, the nation has experienced over 38,000 daily record highs versus 18,500 record lows. So we have a ratio there of 2 to 1, which is the most important point. What's next? The hellish heat is done. Hellish heat dome developed over the hardest hit areas in this heat wave eventually weakened and shifted east, though unusually hot conditions remain over some parts of western and central United States and certainly in Canada. Unfortunately, drought has only intensified in recent weeks around the western U.S., and the overall extent of drought is at its highest level since the U.S. Drought Monitor was established in the year 2000. As of June 29th, it was the expected drought levels between D2 and D4 out of a scale of 4 covered 81% of the West, the first time on record that the index has gone above 80%. South Vancouver Island was recently at stage 4 on a 5-point scale that is used here. We have had no rain in weeks, 38 days today, and more to come. Meanwhile, a downstream buckling of the jet stream has led to an unusually mild, wet week from the southern Rockies to the Midwest, leading to flooding. Nearly 7 inches of rain in the last week of June in parts of Detroit saw 6 to 8 inches on June 26, triggering widespread high-impact flooding. It's now July, the hottest month of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. Extreme ridges of high pressure forming in July have a good chance of setting other high all-time heat records. Why is this happening? Heat waves in the past have set record-breaking levels by half a degree or 1 degree. Records in this event were smashed by up to 10 degrees Celsius. It's way beyond normal range. A temperate ocean-based climate of the BC West Coast is suddenly hotter than Death Valley or the Sahara Desert. Climate disruption caused chiefly by burning fossil fuels is ruining the climate. 76% of carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere comes from the burning of fossil fuels. In spite of this clear and present danger of the fossil fuel cartel, the government of this capitalist country continues to support the building of petro infrastructure. Still still extends credits, tax credits, subsidies of all kinds to the oil cartel and coal mining companies. Nor are fossil fuel profiteers made to clean up after themselves. A quick look at a Google map in a satellite view clearly shows the impacts of the landscape. Scattered along the banks of the Athabasca River is one of the world's largest collections of toxic tailing ponds, able to fill more than 500,000 Olympic swimming pools. They are so toxic, efforts are made to prevent ducks and other birds from going near them. But these efforts have little priority, and many birds die a slow and sad death. Estimates of the cost of this cleanup are $1 trillion. If all the subsidies were removed and the waste had to be remediated by these companies, if that's even possible, the oil business would be a major losing operation. Alberta companies get billions in subsidies from workers' taxes across Canada to produce an earth-killing product, and Premier Kenney complains about equalization payments. We haven't even discussed the massive and continuing violation of Indigenous rights over the resources on their lands, on their unceded lands. The oil cartel has a tight grip on the Ottawa, Edmonton, and all other governments in Canada. They and their bankers must be nationalized, placed under workers' control, and oil production must be shut down as rapidly as possible, replaced by a grid of green, renewable, non-carbon producing energy. And this has to happen very, very soon. We have to fight the pipelines, fight the refineries, and fight the other superstructure. Fight the extraction of the terrible black and toxic dirty oil from the earth. The heat wave just ended is a harbinger of more to come and worse to come. The massive and beautiful boreal forests and the abundant wildlife that thrives in it cannot long survive such heat. They will succumb to the searing sun and drought, and our forests will become deserts, and humans will not be able to survive here. But where will we go? Let me end with this thought. I have talked to people who think that the global warming might be good for Canada, the land of long and cold winters. These people foresee a slow and gradual change, lots of time to adapt, and paradise. We would have a paradise on the Great Lakes and across the prairies. I'm here to tell you now there is no paradise involved in global warming. There is death, drought, crop failures, massive extinction, desperate migration, and suffering. Lots of suffering by the poorest on the earth who contributed practically nothing to the global warming. The oil and gas cartel, the coal miners, their bankers, and their craven politicians who are in the process of committing this greatest crime against humanity possible. They are gambling on the existence of our species for profit. It is not only time to seize their assets with no compensation because they are the proceeds of crime, but to demand that they be arrested and imprisoned. That should put an end to the greedy implications of their work on the human species. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Our next panelist is Gene McGuckin. He is a member of the Vancouver Eco-socialists and of Burnaby residents opposing Kinder Morgan expansion. He is also a draft dodger, an active socialist for 45 years, and a retired past president of the Paper Workers Union local at a paper recycling mill in Burnaby, BC, that produced 100 to 150 tons of paperboard a day. During his 29 years at the mill, while still driving a forklift and heavy equipment, he served for 25 years on the local executive and grievance bargaining committee, and for 22 years was editor of the local monthly newspaper. Prior to that, he had worked as a newspaper reporter, a grade 7 and 8 teacher, a stoker on a Great Lakes iron ore ship, an offset printer, and in several roles at a small live theater. So welcome, Gene.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Kakate and Coquitlam people here in what's otherwise known as New Westminster in British Columbia. So The global crisis caused by long-term climate disruption finally arrived undeniably in BC with the deadly record-smashing heat wave at the end of June, the same day that a draft report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change with dire warnings of worsening climate impacts was leaked to the world media. Neither the deadly heat wave nor the leaked report have prompted any appropriate reactions from BC or Canadian political economic misleaders. Despite climate disruption assessments like this one from a US scientist who worked at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Jet Propulsion Lab, who told media, "It has moved up my sense of where we are by about a decade or even more." Let me just briefly outline why this crisis must be dealt with quickly and thoroughly, and why this will not happen if we depend on our current governments. Then we'll approach the 120-year-old socialist question: what is to be done? Let me start this way. If I load a gun, point it at you, and pull the trigger, I am guilty of a serious crime, possibly murder. I will be arrested, charged, tried, and punished. That's a deterrent to shooting people. But fossil fuel corporate executives make, and conceal for decades, decisions that they know with absolute certainty will cause climate disruptions resulting in death and injury for huge numbers of people. Yet no one is criminally charged. There is no punishment for the premeditated murders, no deterrent. Well, so no big problem, right? Most deaths and injuries occur in the global south or to poor folk in the north. As in BC these last few weeks, local climate disruption deaths do make headlines. Politicians compete with their sorrowful sound bites about, quote, what we can do to keep such misfortunes from being repeated. What we can do, that is, as long as it doesn't reduce corporate fossil fuel profits. Because under capitalism, profits are the basic reality that must take precedence. Eliminating this root cause of the slaughter is not considered a practical or allowable political solution. After 9 million people were impacted and hundreds killed in British Columbia and south of the border, mostly people who are poor, old, and unwell, no corporate executives or fossil fuel investors or their governmental backers were unduly troubled. Premier John Horgan blurted out the callous wisdom that, quote, fatalities are a part of life. But no other provincial or federal government officials have proposed the obvious emergency response to the fatalities, which are all too likely to recur. No political decisions to accelerate the transition off fossil fuels, no immediate end to old growth logging or a crash program on reducing agricultural greenhouse gases. Construction continues on the fossil fuel pipelines. Work proceeds on the Site C Dam and BC's 20,000 fracking wells, key parts of a methane-spewing liquid natural gas export industry. Tens of billions in government subsidies to big oil and gas are still shelled out by unconsulted taxpayers. In Ottawa, on June 29th, the day Lytton, BC, set the all-time ADM record of 49.6 degrees centigrade, and the day before the village burned to the ground, the Canadian Senate passed the much ballyhooed Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, another Trudeau victory to add to his other pro-emission policies since the Paris Accords. Emission targets are not contained in the law. They're supposed to come later, but not before a fall election. Then there are supposed to be 5-year targets starting in 2030, but no carbon budgets that would allow such targets to be accountable. No overall plan to reduce the many interwoven corporate climate disruption activities. But there are plans to actually increase fossil fuel production, supposedly allowed by the net zero con game of using highly questionable offsets as a trade-off for continuing to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And there's a reliance on unproved carbon capture technology and hugely expensive green and blue hydrogen production. 2 weeks after the heat dome deaths, Trudeau's liberals, I call them liberals instead of liberals, dishonored them by submitting Canada's update carbon emission reductions to the United Nations. Instead of the internationally agreed target of 50%, the liberals promised only a 40 to 45% reduction. And that target is supposedly going to be reached through inadequate carbon taxes and the net zero method I mentioned above. and export of the world's dirtiest oil expands with plans completions of the Trans Mountain Pipeline to the Pacific and the Line 3 pipeline to the US. Meanwhile, at the provincial level, Premier Horgan came into office vowing to use every tool in the toolbox to stop Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, and later made the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, a law of British Columbia. Well, he's still looking for the key to his toolbox, and Trans Mountain expansion proceeds, and his sending militarized police to force pipeline through Indigenous lands and the Wet'su'wet'en territories shows what he and his party think of Indigenous people's rights, of increased carbon and methane emissions, and also what they think of the law. All these apparent contradictions between promises and what actually gets done are not bad planning and execution. This is the new denialism, where CEOs and government ministers used to deny that there were any climate problems. Now they say, yeah, we know, and we're on it, and do nothing, or do it slowly, like the 2035 deadline for banning internal combustion engine vehicles. Despite a 7% drop in global emissions from humans in 2020, the atmospheric concentration of carbon increased. Some scientists worry that the dreaded feedback loops may have begun operating. I could go on about the worldwide environmental, economic, medical, and social crises and disasters capitalism has caused, in addition to climate disruption, other breached and nearly breached planetary limits involving fresh water, forests, sea levels, biodiversity, etc. And also about the eco-catastrophes people in other parts of the world are suffering that are worse than what we have faced so far. But I just wanted to set the background for what socialists really have to talk about, i.e., what must be done. And because capitalist governments clearly will not, what we need to do. And that last word, do, is the key. Over the past decade, we have heard and read lots of progressive ideas about the multiplying crises of capitalism. But most of them are lists of things that we need to change, or the results of that change that we would like to see. There is much less discussion on the tactics and strategies needed to bring about these changes, and therefore very little exploration of how we mobilize and train ourselves to actually win the battles we need to fight. I am not a specialist on any of these questions, but I venture to put forward what, generally speaking, I believe our side should be focused on. Three things are essential. First, in our own communities and nationally and globally, we need to plan and implement many interwoven changes very quickly to reduce the deadly consequences of onrushing environmental, economic, social, and public health emergencies, and to mitigate those we can no longer prevent. So with a law like Canada's so-called net zero accountability law, or the US multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill, we have to leapfrog the stage where we say, oh, it is far from the gold standard, but it's a first step in the right direction. We need to move way beyond first steps to effective, comprehensive solutions yesterday. Gradualism is as bad as doing nothing, worse, because it demobilizes the struggle. Our plans must also continue to deconstruct all the damages of racism, sexism, heterosexism, colonialism, and imperialism resulting from capitalism's centuries of global dominance. Priorities will include reinstating Indigenous territorial rights and massively aiding the global South, including by welcoming climate refugees. That's the first thing. Second, we must get rid of the time-wasting tactical illusions that we can convince capitalist CEOs and their government puppets to lead this emergency struggle or even go along with it. It's not a matter of their not understanding. It's a matter of their allegiance to the capitalist system, to the market, to the competition, to the constant growth, and to the profits. So let's recognize that petitions are not mind changers, though they may be a good way to enlarge supporter contact lists. Letters to the editor are only very rarely creating enough pressure to thwart minor corporate wrongs. Telling politicians that they will lose our support in the next election is useless if that means a less progressive adversary might get voted in. Third, the logical conclusion of all that is that we ourselves need to develop the power to do what must be done to counter capitalism at its eighth power. Most importantly, we need working class power. We need well-informed union members and unions who will use the strike weapon to stop the flow of profits and balance the economic and police power of capital and its state. But we also need them to use their on-the-job expertise to help come up with needed solutions to climate disruption that we can only guess at. We need union and non-union sisters and brothers who will mobilize in their thousands, as was common in BC up until 2005, to take to the streets. We need workplace occupations and, when possible, redirection of production, whether supplies, information, communication links, or whatever, to the service of the urgent, rapid, democratic red-green transition. We also require what I'll call community power, informed and largely self-organized groups who understand the necessity for social solidarity and can link up to launch demos, occupations, and blockades to get things done at City Hall, to get relief to at-risk populations, subverting police and military action against community power, whatever. These mobilizations, which we should never think will automatically bring capital to see things our way, are nevertheless extremely important because they let us see each other in action, which bolsters the important movement building belief that we have a good chance to win. But community power should also include getting more people involved in the local level with discussing problems and their solutions. Not so long ago, thousands of people in Canada and elsewhere came out to meetings to discuss winning a Green New Deal. Hopefully we can make that happen again, going far beyond the concept of a deal to perhaps a green new society. We are going to have to cement our victories, not just by defeating capital in numerous battles, but by replacing capitalism and its state powers, promote profiteering, and in turn, our finance to buy it. Bringing together our skills, experiences, and imaginations to find solutions will be the way that we learn, that we become the germ of the democratic, social, and economic planning system we will need when we replace capitalism. And of course, before we replace capitalism in the here and now, we need to go beyond developing more class power and more community power in our workplaces, neighborhoods, towns, and cities. We need to challenge for government power. We have to fight to begin implementing what needs to be done over the objections and obstacles of capital and its state. And for the time being, we have to use as effectively as possible the existing political system's possibilities, which includes elections. Recent polls tell us a large majority of Canadians are now convinced climate disruption is a negative tending towards disastrous. And they want a shift in investment from fossil fuels to renewables. Even most Canadian oil and gas workers now want to transfer to net zero jobs. Of course, no parliamentary party shares these progressive goals or numerous other such goals. So how do we make effective use of elections? If we hope to have an effect on large numbers of voters, we obviously can't run on the maximal demand for immediate socialist revolution. But running on the usual social democratic or left-green minimal demands for gradual, partial, and temporary reforms would be the same as giving up, because these reforms are not big enough or fast enough. A preferable approach, making transitional demands, would focus on the current level of consciousness of workers in popular sectors, like the rising awareness of climate disruption's impacts and costs, the frustrations and grieving caused by the inept handling of the pandemic, sympathy with First Nations struggles, attention to growing job and housing crises, and many more. In each area, and probably more, we would put forward common sense transitional demands that capitalism cannot, not just will not, but cannot accept, because doing so would disrupt its whole profit-oriented system. As more and more people who consider transitional demands reasonable and worth fighting for, but who come to realize that capitalism cannot agree to these demands, cannot provide what survival requires for individuals, their families, our society, and the global biosphere, more and more of them will realize that the only choice is replacing capitalism with the democratic, social, and economic planning of socialism. And the totally open and public transitional goal would be for working people and our allies to take governmental power away from the capitalist puppet parties, thus posing the question of who rules and whose interests. Okay, so there are many other transitional demands, and there are also the questions of what we would do in an election that I don't have time to go through, but I would invite everybody to continue this discussion when you get your chance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. Now we're going to go to our producer, Kurt, and take the first 3 questions from our online audience. He will paste them in the chat and read them out slowly. Kurt? Those not speaking, please turn
sorry,
on.
I was having an issue getting my microphone unmuted. So, sorry, Jean, I'm going to mute you right now. Thank you. So, our first question comes from Anton Budney, who asks, how do we convince fossil fuel workers eco-socialism has their best interests in mind? Barry Weisletter asks, please describe the difference between eco-socialism and what the Green Party and the NDP advocate. And Dinner Franklin asks, I read recently that in the US, there are 3 times more workers in renewable energies than fossil fuels. If true, would this information help change minds?
Okay, you've heard the 3 questions. You have each have up to 5 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3. It's your choice. And we will start with Jean, then Flo, then Gary. Jean? I think you're muted, Jean.
Yes, I just couldn't see my microphone. It's covered up by another notice. Anyway, so, well, the first question I can address, because I am a retired member of the union that represents most energy workers in this country. And in fact, I made a stab at trying to convince some of them, not of eco-socialism per se, but as of trying to pay attention to what was happening environmentally about 10 years ago, when I got myself invited to a regional conference to give a speech. And I got no reaction there, very little. I have been badgering officials of Unifor over the last few years that I know, who used to be young militants when I knew them, and now they're in the leadership, which makes them completely different people. And they're also not moving very quickly. However, 2 months ago, one of the people that I know, who used to be my staff rep, announced to the media that Unifor was now in favor of clean transition to clean fuels, away from fossil fuels. No specifics on that. And then last week, a group called Iron and Earth, which is a group of tradespeople from Alberta originally. I mean, they've spread out to other provinces now, but originally people from northern Alberta, who were founded on the basis of trying to get the government and the industry to take responsibility for retraining them for non-fossil fuel jobs. They announced that they had done a poll, and 2/3 of fossil fuel workers are now would prefer to have net zero, quote, net zero jobs. So again, I don't know what how eco-socialism would apply to the brothers and sisters, but there is a transition happening, and I can only rejoice in that, but I can't be more precise about it because I don't know these people anymore. I've been retired for 13 years. That's the only one I can answer, really.
Okay, thank you, Jean. Flo?
Hi, I think I'll answer, I guess, a bit of the last question. Would knowledge that there's more renewable workers and fossil fuel workers help change minds? And also a bit of the first question, like, how can we convince fossil fuel workers that eco-socialism has their best interest? For me, I think it does come down, just when I'm talking to like people that work in these industries, and I do talk to quite a bit, like Indigenous folks as well around here that want to get on the pipeline and stuff. it really does come down to like something's here, something's being like dangled basically in front of your face, like a good job, a good opportunity. They're like chomping at the bit to hire you if you're from an Indigenous community kind of thing. And like, I think laborers are getting like $50 an hour sometimes. So they're very like there's something right there. And then when you contrast that to like, we're going to end fossil fuels and we're going to ban fracking, and then there's no like follow up with, but you're going to do this, and whatever happens, like you're going to be fine, basically. I think that part is really missing. So you need kind of like an immediate action plan that's going to meet people like where they are, not in 10 years, like maybe we'll have green energy going in 10 years, and maybe we'll have a geothermal thing. And, you know, even though it'll take like 10 years to build that, like, you know, I think once it becomes kind of abstract and in the future, people just get really suspicious. They don't trust government to follow through with some of their promises, which, as I said, I feel like is reasonable, you know, still waiting for that electoral reform to happen. So really you need like a plan and something to basically come in right where they are and pick up right there, which again is what I think a jobs guarantee would help. At least sort of facilitate that, because it's like there wouldn't be any opportunity to fall between the cracks kind of thing. And you know, the union question is interesting too, because I think they are in a similar position right now almost as industry, where it's like they have to cling on to that industry because they're sector specific and job specific unions. So if we even want to break out of that, like, I don't know exactly how, but I think we should try to think a little bit creatively about labor organization as a whole and different kinds of associations that could happen, maybe even, you know, cross sector and just kind of like pan worker solidarity. I think that would also help, but just trying to kind of develop a network that could really meet people where they're at and not give them promises without like a tangible plan that's really like right there to help them out in the immediate term.
Okay, thank you, Flo. Gary?
First of all, I wanted to thank Flo for her earlier contribution on the whole question of affecting workers that are involved in the oil and gas and coal industry and the infrastructure related there too, because that's a huge problem. We can't expect the current union leadership, with its totally reformist perspective and just try to keep the dues-paying members working and paying dues, to lead this. So part of what we have to do is build organizations like the Workers' Action Movement, build WAMs in every union and WAM branches or chapters in every union, and start so there's you can bring together people to do concrete work around education and development of alternatives. The second thing is we need to think of a form in which you can bring together the people who have the most to lose, in this case the employees, are brought right to the table. Those workers, their unions, and then the rank and file representatives are brought to the table to find out exactly what they feel they need in order to be able to transition with a relative economic safety. I don't think it has to be up close and personal and direct, as Flo keeps telling us. So we have to put some more thinking into that, and who we where we put our demands, who can do that, how can they do it, so that the people facing the sacrifices are right at the table. So that's on that question. On the question of the differences between eco-socialism and the Green Party supports capitalism. We support the replacement of capitalism with socialist democratic planning and social purposes and social needs, as against private ownership and private profit for just generating more and more inequality. They wanted to use, basically they have a technocratic approach. They want to fiddle with regulations, fiddle with this little goal and that little goal, fiddle with technology, all within the framework of capitalism. You can't change the profit motive unless you overthrow the system. And that for that you need a mass movement that learns by its own experience in mass action, and is challenged to sees that the reasonable demands of ordinary people cannot be met under capitalism, and begins to figure out that the system itself has to go, and that they have to take over the running of the economy and society directly, and that they can do it. So the Green Party is now no part of that. As a matter of fact, the Green Party currently is led by a person who supports the Israeli oppression of the Palestinians, as opposed to the right of women to control their own bodies. And of course, she joins Elizabeth May and all the other Green leaders like Weaver here in British Columbia, and Firstenau and so on, who really want to do this within the framework of continuing private ownership and private profit. So there's a massive difference, and it's an irreconcilable difference. They don't. It's not that much of a difference with the NDP leadership either. The difference with the NDP isn't the fact that they have a bourgeois program. They do a program of timid reform, but the class basis. The NDP is based on the labor movement. It's an independent. The labor movement is independent of the capitalists. The NDP is based on the unions, not on capitalist contributions and so on. So it has the capacity. It's the only independent labor party in North America. So we work there, not because we agree with them. We absolutely oppose the Social Democrats, who lead both the unions and the NDP. And we want to replace them. We want to counterpose our program to their program. We want to propose transitional solutions to their timid reformism and show that their reformism is hopeless and is not going anywhere. I think one of the best ways that happens is that Horgan, who is the Premier of British Columbia, is demonstrating clearly that he has no answers whatsoever
30 seconds.
to the climate crisis, and that he is a massive contributor to the climate crisis. With his LNG Canada project, the related Coastlink gas pipeline, which leaks methane all over the place, the support for fracking. Just recently, it came out that the amount of methane getting into the atmosphere, the pollution getting into the atmosphere, is twice what the government said it was, double what the government said it was. That's the kind of lying that's going on. So anyway, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Kurt for 3 more questions.
All right, so our first question comes from Judy Kosh, who asked, do people in third world countries suffer more from fires than people in North America? And Anne Grant asked, I think we all agree this is a climate emergency and that we need a major system change. What we need to put our heads together to figure out the strategy tactics to get to the new system. So we should concentrate on this task. What do people suggest? How do we get to the working public and get them to seize their power? And we need to do this very quickly. Time is running out. Ellen Ramsey asks, we have massively overstepped the boundaries between human activity and the nature that surrounds us. The heat dome, the forest fires are all symptoms of this. Do we have to deindustrialize?
Okay, you've heard and seen the questions. So we will now go to first Gary, then Flo, then Jean, and you each have up to 5 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions. Gary?
Third world suffering is massive. It always has been, and it's getting worse under global climate disruption. That's why you see all those massive marches to the U.S. border in the south. That's a large part of that is safety because of violence and the increasing violence in those countries. But one of the things that contributes to the increasing violence in those countries is global warming, crop failures, and land becoming less. There's less arable land, and so on. And many of these people are based on land and so on. So, yes, it is causing immense suffering, and it will cause much more suffering in the third world earlier. And once again, let me say, these people have contributed practically nothing to the global catastrophe that is brewing. There's the 2 billion poorest people on the earth have contribute net zero have never contributed anything more than net zero, and yet they're the ones that suffer, not the billionaires in their their mansions and their big yachts and their rockets. So yes, the answer to that, Judy, is yes. And Grant has asked the most important question of all: what exactly do we do? The only thing I can suggest, there is no magic solution. Climate will get worse, and it will affect people's consciousness more and more, and that will be a massive factor assisting us. It's just the way that socialist groups cannot get the working class to overthrow capitalism. Capitalism generates the conditions in which the workers have little choice, and then the leadership, an organized, educated leadership, can help make that their reaction more efficient, more effective, and direct it towards the task of taking over the state and creating a new state. So what we can do is work where we are. If we're in the unions, we should be working there to change the minds of the workers and to counterpose a program of emergency action to the virtually do nothing attitude of the union leadership. If we're in the NDP, we should be doing the same thing. But if we're in community organizations, we should be doing the same thing. Always reminding them that as the existential crisis most facing us is can we live in the biosphere? Will we have a viable biosphere? And how much longer? So, it has to be at that level. I don't know how to jump over our heads into a magic solution. I don't think there is one. We work where you are, be fearless in raising this issue, suggest specifics based on those people's understanding and how it affects those people, and try to bring it together in coalitions and united fronts so that we can build more mass actions and people can see that larger and larger numbers of people are willing to do something about this.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Flo, 5 minutes.
Okay, guess I'll tackle that second question a bit. I mean, it's definitely like the question, right? Like, how do we get to the rank and file? Obviously the union leadership does present a bit of an obstacle, as that we were talking about. They are reformist, and they're also not really inclined or incentivized at all to think about switching industries, right? They're basically, the way that they've been set up is to advocate for their own industry and their own employees. So that presents a lot of problems. I just think, we do have to focus on structural change and I guess dual power, like to echo what Gary was saying, work where you are. If you're within the unions and trade unions right now, the Workers' Action Movement, the WAM campaign, they're doing some really great things within the unions as they're currently set up. And in terms of like the big masses of unorganized labor, I'll just say what I was saying before, is I really think we do have to think more creatively and kind of out of the box in terms of what is possible for labor representation. Unions are one form of labor representation, but they're not the be all and all, or especially not how they are set up currently. So as far as I understand it, like there can be associations of workers. Like I know that in other countries there are sort of pan worker unions, or basically just different structures. And I think we should think about what can we do? What are the limits? We don't have to think about what people have done before, but what could we enact, and what couldn't we? Like what's off the table? And really, maybe there's not that much that's off the table in terms of the outside of the electoral system and also the unions. I think a general strike is the way to go. Again, it's sort of just a question of like, how would we get workers on board for a general strike? And definitely trying to make the transitional demand that you are going for in your general strike, one that is very obviously going to benefit every person, all the workers, and isn't industry specific, is I think the way to go. And that final question about degrowth, like deindustrializing, yeah, I think we're going to have to reckon with that sooner rather than later as well. It's just not feasible to have an economy and a system based on infinite growth when we don't have completely infinite resources, and we're just, I was talking about statistics earlier too. I think this could actually go a long way in that too. Like the way that we measure growth and benefit in the economy doesn't really make a lot of sense, because yeah, sure, okay, maybe the way that we calculate GDP, it's gone up, but like where has that money gone and who has it actually benefited? Just because GDP has expanded doesn't mean that the majority of people are actually better off. So also just the way I think that we conceptualize and measure progress in the economy is something that could change and maybe go some ways towards helping us structure that.
Okay, thank you, Flo. Jean, 5 minutes.
Okay, well, difficult questions, but I think that the first question about third world countries, I don't know about the whole planet, but I do know that the Amazon was tagged again last week for being a net emitter of carbon into the atmosphere instead of a carbon sink. And of course, that has something to do with the imperialist supported government of Brazil, which continues, and the various marketing mechanisms that require the what do they call it, the palm oil and other biofuels to be harvested there by capitalist corporations that are claiming to go green because they're not doing fossil fuels anymore. They're just burning down in the Amazon. So, I mean, there's a problem. I mean, as I say, I don't know the whole world, but I have read stuff about Southeast Asia and the islands of the East Indies. And it's probably true in lots of other places that the devastation is happening as a result of right-wing governments and capitalist corporations. In terms of the question here of how do we get people together? Well, that's kind of been the question that a lot of us have lived our lives doing, right? So my iron law that I've developed is that the way you get lots of people moving at the same time, and I've been in a couple of situations in British Columbia in 1983 and in 2004 where lots of people were moving at the same time. It seems that what is required is that people have to feel as though they're threatened by something very important that they want to prevent. But the second thing is that they have to have some belief that they're going to be able to win if they go into a battle. In 1983, we had a fight against the provincial government, which arrogantly moved something like 28 bills, anti-people bills, at the same time in the legislature, and immediately mobilized tens of thousands of people across the province. In the Lower Mainland, we were meeting every week with the trade union movement, but also churches and old age groups and various other things, with 300 or 400 people showing up every single week to have meetings to discuss what we were doing and how to fight back. As soon as the labor leadership made a rotten deal with the government, those meetings declined to 100 a week to 30 a week to disappearing. So people, got something better to do if we're not going to fight and win. In 2004, a similar thing happened where there was like tons of people, including non-union workers, who moved into battle around a general strike call and started walking out. And then the union leadership made a deal with the government, and poof, it was gone. I mean, it wasn't poof because there were still some people on Vancouver Island who continued to occupy and do things that were radical, and but only for a few days. So I think that the other thing that we need to talk about among ourselves, the people that are on this call and stuff like that, is how to get socialists together. Some of us used to belong to organizations that had hundreds hundreds of members anyway. And now we're in little groupuscules that if we were all in the same organization together, we would get economies of scale. We would be able to cooperate in taking messages to different places and planning and organizing actions in different places. But it's something that we can't do as long as we're all in a very small group of schools. And we should at some point have
30 seconds.
should at some point have a strategic discussion about what we can do about that rather than just accepting it as the norm. That's all I got.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to move back to Kurt for our final 3 questions. Go ahead, Kurt.
Okay. First question comes from myself. Ask, with China becoming one of the fastest growing fossil fuel using nations, one the Canadian government wishes to export fossil fuels to, how can we use our solidarity with the Chinese workers to eliminate fossil fuel usage? Kosh asks, are there places in Canada that are more affected by wildfires more than others? And Barry Wise letter states, citizens don't control the state. The state is an instrument of capitalist rule. It will arrest workers who try to arrest corporate criminals unless revolutionary workers lead a general strike to win.
Okay, seems the last one is a question, but I guess he's asking, do you agree? So we will now go to our panelists who have 5 minutes each, and we will start with Jean, then Flo, then Gary. Jean?
Right. I haven't the foggiest idea how to operate in China. I would love to know more about that. So if you get a good answer, Kurt, come back to us with it. Are there places in Canada that are more by wildfires? I think that British Columbia and northern Alberta have, in recent years, had the worst problems. But there are lots of places in Ontario and Quebec and other forested provinces that also have the problem. Our problem here, I think, is that we have British Columbia and probably in northern Alberta too, is that we have had an ecosystems that depend on snow melt, on ice that is stored on mountaintops during the winter, will melt slowly and flow down into rivers and irrigate the forests. And we don't have that anymore because there isn't that much snow. And when it melts in a hurry and causes floods and causes glacial collapses along the coast, which are going to be a problem one of these days, one of these years. But also and the same thing's happening all the way down the West Coast in California too, right? Like I was reading stuff about California where they're saying that the air is so dry that when there's a thunderstorm, the rain does not reach the ground. The lightning reaches the ground, but the rain does not reach the ground. And that kind of thing is starting to happen here in British Columbia too, in that heat dome situation that we went through a few weeks ago. There were fire tornadoes. I had never heard of a fire tornado. I don't know anybody who ever heard of a fire tornado, but they were reaching up past the regular atmosphere into the stratosphere. They were doing all kinds of things. I mean, I don't know. And in terms of Barry's comment, citizens control the state unless workers lead a general strike to win. And this goes back to one of the earlier questions, like how we get people involved in a general strike. Well, you just got to keep on, again, having the organization to carry the message and the analysis out. When we tried to put together, a bunch of us put together a group called Prepare the General Strike Committee in 2002 in British Columbia. And we were vilified by the labor leadership for years until right into the beginning of 2004. And then it was the hospital workers who precipitated the consciousness change because they went out on strike against massive layoffs, massive job cuts, massive wage and benefit cuts. And they said, fuck this. And they went on strike. The legislature legislated them back to work. And they said, we're not going back to work. And all of a sudden, there was tons of people that were talking about a general strike. That people were coming out to me after 3 years of telling me I was an idiot, saying, "Oh, I guess you were right." So I don't know. I mean, sometimes it's things that precipitate that you can't predict, but you're there with the message, talking to them ahead of time. Maybe that'll have some impact on how it unfolds.
Okay, thank you, Flo.
Okay, I'll give my thoughts on that, the China question. I think it's interesting. I don't really know either, but what I've heard from China is that they want to be the leading renewables resources energy source provider. So that's interesting. I mean, it's still in the market-based economy. Everything's going to go towards where the market opportunities are, right? So what I'm thinking is, I mean, do we really need to be trading fossil fuels between countries? Maybe it would be better to try to support countries in becoming more energy independent, that they could produce their own energy, don't need to transport it and trade it globally. Obviously, multinational companies, oil companies, would not be down with that because it would cut into their profits. So, but aside from that, I think just trying to, transitionally trying to create those sort of market opportunities, and with what China's doing generally in terms of trying to create a sort of alternative market that's away from the US hegemonic sphere, there could be some opportunity within that to sort of develop a new relationship where it was more reciprocal in terms of trying to support each other in energy independence and moving towards renewables. But China's probably going to use a lot more energy before they're really up and running on renewables. So I don't know if there's anything that could be done in the very short term, but looking to the future, that is what I would think is a possible inroad for cooperation there.
Okay, thank you, Flo. Gary?
I read an article recently that the Chinese government states that it will be decarbonizing beginning in 2040, but between now and then, it will be carrying on processes of creating energy sources that are carbon free, but that it has its plans certainly do include using carbon fuel and increasing their carbon output, or their net output, until 2040, and then bringing it down. So that's all I know. But they are they seem very intent. They are the best suppliers of solar panels. They make the best solar panels in the world, and it's one of the things that the Americans are trying to stop them exporting with sanctions and so on. And that fits right into the fossil fuel industry, which is centered in the United States. A general strike is, when the entire general strike is an expression of the entire working class moving at once around a specific set of demands, or in response to a specific negative situation. And I agree very much with Jean's notion that people have to feel that they have to feel afraid. They have to feel that something very that they just are not willing to tolerate is happening to them. So these are not conditions we create. These are conditions created by capitalism, and what we have to do is we have to prepare ourselves to be able to take best advantage of those, which means, as I keep saying, building the Workers' Action Movement and the We're Union Movement, building the Socialist Caucus and the NDP, building left-wing organizations that fight climate change on the ground, that are willing to do what's necessary to stop old-growth forest cutting, that stop pipelines, stop refinery building, stop all that stuff, and so building an actual green movement. And one wonders if it isn't time to start thinking about an organization, which I guess WHAM could become much more clearly, climate, against climate disruption, and build an actual workers' movement for a livable biosphere. And the other final thing is on that is to build leadership, and we're trying to make a contribution to that by building Socialist Action. We know in the future that will come from the other components of that leadership will come out of the struggles of the working class, and that there will be fusions and splits and all sorts of things that, as processes that are involved in creating a mass working class rooted leadership that understands the lessons of Marx and Lenin, and so on. But we're doing what we can right now in Socialist Action to build a pan-Canadian core. To build a core for that leadership. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. In fact, a special thanks to all of our panelists, Flo, Jean, and Gary, and of course to Kurt, our producer. Also, thanks to our listening and viewing audience who presented great questions to the panelists. So please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining Socialist Action, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com. Or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. And once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next essay webcast will be on Thursday, July the 29th p.m. at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, that is. And the topic, Newfoundland, fighting the furious cuts. Why do I say it that way? Well, because it's a play on words. The Premier of Newfoundland is Andrew Furey. So, and it's featuring Victor Morgan, who of course is from Newfoundland and Labrador, and 2 other speakers that will be announced shortly. So in the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active. Bye for now.